Our paper begins with a stocktake of contemporary literature on the manosphere and its core themes, evaluating the evolving status of this online ecosystem of anti-women actors. It attempts to advance our theoretical comprehension of the Neo-Manosphere and its likely future directions by identifying and evaluating 5 key developments which distinguish it from the earlier manosphere, namely mainstreaming, monetization, ideological and ethnic diversification, migrations to new platforms, and overlap with other extreme ideologies, most of which are largely driven by recommender algorithms. And our paper also attends to misogyny as a risk factor for violent extremism and some literature that's emerging on disengagement from the manosphere. So to understand the key developments and trends in the manosphere since Ging's article, we identified 430 articles on the manosphere published since 2019 through a hand search and through an AI-powered Research Rabbit application. From these, we draw on approximately 100 to analyse some of the most recent publications to ensure that our map is up to date. So the first finding that we came across in the literature was this trend towards the mainstreaming of the manosphere. The emergence of a raft of new social media platforms has been instrumental in facilitating dynamics of both mainstreaming on popular platforms such as TikTok and radicalisation into more niche underground spaces such as Gab, Discord and Telegram. In particular, short video formats, which are heavily driven by recommender algorithms such as TikTok and YouTube Shorts, have received considerable attention of late for their ability to push ideological, congenial and increasingly extreme content into users' feeds. These can rapidly amplify content, as is the case, for example, of Andrew Tate's videos on TikTok, which reached over 12 billion views before he was banned from the platform in 2022. A number of experimental studies using sock puppet accounts have demonstrated the speed and frequency with which young male users on TikTok in particular are served manosphere and manfluencer content based on their gender and search and viewing histories. Baker et al. Have also shown that banning accounts is wholly ineffective, as Tate's content remained the most recommended to their male sock puppet accounts, both on TikTok and YouTube Shorts, long after his account was shut down. This is due to widespread re-amplification of his videos by micro-influencers and fans, who also use ostensibly innocuous hashtags such as mindset, motivation, and money to direct users towards this content and this content towards them. In addition, platform and subreddit closures have caused certain manosphere communities, such as incels, to migrate to more dedicated spaces, such as incels.is, as well as to more mainstream platforms. Recent studies have shown that the incel community has grown in size and reach, and that incel ideologies have become more mainstream. Having migrated beyond incel-specific servers and Reddit fora to large social media platforms such as TikTok. This is also borne out by Beale et al.'s cross-platform analysis of violent extremist language, which found that there is a clear upward trend in the level of extremist discussions within the incelosphere between 2016 and 2022, with a trend towards violent extremist language. This increasing prevalence of incel ideologies in society is undoubtedly cause for alarm. However, as Sawinski warns, it is important to avoid regarding the violent misogyny of incels as an exception with regard to other forms of misogyny, and instead ensure that inceldom is considered in continuity with structural male supremacism. We should also remember that incel-motivated attacks on women are far rarer than other more pervasive incidents of violence against women. A number of theorists have offered rich contributions to the manosphere research by theorising its emergence in relation to neoliberal capitalism. For example, Bajalka et al. Addressed the recent monetisation of the manosphere, which in turn is linked to the rise of influencer culture. This political economy of media framework first focuses on how influential digital content producers construct a perception of threat in their audience, while simultaneously positioning themselves as a solution to that same threat. According to Bajalka et al., influential figures within the manosphere perpetuate symbiotic cycles of ontological security and insecurity through YouTube and social media content they produce. They regard such cycles as a protection racket in which thought leaders of the manosphere maintain and grow their audience from whom they extract material, social or political resources. This identification of the manosphere as a grift is an important new development in the scholarship, which demonstrates how many facets of the neo-manosphere exploit existing vulnerabilities and monetize them in a cycle of ontological racketeering, which consists of threat proliferation, affirming and extending in viewers a sense of crisis, alternately promising to deliver solutions to such threats. Importantly, Bujaka et al. Draw our attention to how the solutions provided by such online business models rely on the kinds of existential insecurities and crises that are a legacy in many ways of neoliberalism and capitalism. Sorry, one of my slides is not there for some reason, which is very frustrating, but never mind. Part of this picture involves, as I said in the previous slide, monetizing wellness, this shift from overtly anti-feminist content towards more male self-help hacks and an ostensible concern for men's well-being. Akin to the individualized solutions to structural issues promoted elsewhere online, health and wellness-based influences reinforce the idea of taking care of one's body in the manosphere as the best strategy to navigate crisis conditions. Within this neoliberal worldview, agency is found in adopting pseudoscientific wellness rituals and using alternative health products. When wellness discourses do not consider the interests of the individual within a collective context, for example, we saw that with anti-maskers at the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, they can produce a survival of the fittest worldview, and that worldview is alive and well in the manosphere. This worldview obviously entails illness being one's own fault, a moral failing, and this shift towards health, wellness and stoic paradigms is yet to be explored in great depth in the literature on the manosphere. An exception is Joshua Cidarella's work, his study of hypermasculinity, in which he personally experimented with a range of trends that have proliferated in the manosphere. These include the bro-science practices of mewing, an exercise technique designed to refine one's jawline for a more Chad-like appearance, lifting, seed retention, minimizing ejaculation, sunning, exposing one's testicles to sunlight for 5 minutes daily to improve virility. I do not recommend treating yourself like a guinea pig for insane health advice found on niche internet message boards, but when you cannot trust the experts, you must DYOR. I couldn't believe any of these bizarre programs would actually make someone fit, so I had to try it out. At my peak, I was eating 2 pounds of meat and 6 raw eggs per day. I would occasionally supplement with some leafy green vegetables like spinach or kale. After a period of about 3 months, I got very lean and muscular. It was probably the best shape I'd ever been in. It was a lot of work to manage my daily consumption so carefully, and I probably could not have done it if I wasn't living in my mum's basement at the time. Studies of incel and anti-feminist communities have tended to focus on white men due to these communities' predominantly white male origins. However, many of the manosphere's communities have diversified significantly in recent years. This is especially the case in the incel community, where recent race polls on the latest incel forum, incels.is, indicate that white incels are in a minority, with Black, Asian and Indian incels together accounting for the majority. Despite this, the incel community remains deeply racist and structured by racialized hierarchies. While incels often have conflicting ideologies about sexual market value and race ethnicity, there is broad consensus that white men are the most desirable to women of all ethnicities. Non-white incels are referred to as ethnic cells, rice cells or curry cells, reflecting the widely internalized belief that Asian men are desexualized and seen as feminine or weak in Western countries. Black pill science is also used to claim that Black and Latino men are hypersexual and hypermasculine, with Black alpha males or chads referred to as Tyrone. Meanwhile, on more mainstream platforms such as TikTok and YouTube Shorts, a number of Black manfluencers have risen to fame, such as Myron Gaines, pictured here, and Walter Weeks, also pictured here, hosts of the Fresh and Fit podcast. Gaines and Weeks regularly use language to appeal to Black men, for example, by invoking the discourse of social justice movements, albeit reappropriated to justify misogyny and male superiority. According to Dashiell, Gaines and Weeks invariably slip in and out of African-American vernacular English, which conveys not only authenticity, but also forges a connection with Black listeners. He also maintains that narratives about men being kept down by women double up as dog whistles to Black men, signalling the ways in which the dominant white culture forces them to behave in certain ways. This ethnic diversification is difficult to square with the manosphere's significant overlaps with the alt-right and the far-right. For example, despite its attempts to appeal to a black male audience, in 2023, Fresh and Fit hosted white supremacist Nick Fuentes. Similarly, the Tate brothers must walk a fine line between far-right rhetoric on immigration and their own ethnicity. Their father was African-American and status as migrants. In yet another ostensibly contradictory twist, akin to some European right-leaning politicians, both Andrew Tate and Sneeko have recently converted to Islam. The appeal of Islam to Western men's rights activists is not only its apparent anti-wokeness and conservative gender roles, but also the prospect of reaching another vast audience. Figures like Tate and Sneeko draw on stereotypes about Islam as patriarchal, stoic, and intolerant of progressive agendas to challenge Western liberalism, despite their own permissive lifestyles. For many, the most confounding development that we found in the contemporary manosphere is the emergence of anti-feminist trad women online accounts. Intersecting with the far right, but not necessarily of the far right, such women uphold hierarchical essentialist understandings of gender seen elsewhere in the manosphere. As Kudinsi writes, there has hitherto been an emphasis on socio-cultural factors and economic interests in accounting for far-right men's mobilisation, while women's involvement has been viewed as largely driven by private issues. Vivian Leidig's exploration of far-right women influences is a valuable contribution to understanding the new entrepreneurial tradwives and anti-feminist influencers who trade on intimacy and authenticity to seek new recruits for gender-aggressive, anti-LGBTQ and white nationalist agendas. These can be broadly divided into celebrity tradwives, such as Estee Williams, Hannah Neeleman, who you can see pictured just down the bottom here, and Nara Smith on the other side, at the bottom there, with her husband giving her a hug as she pours milk into the pot. These women idealise pre-modern domestic subservience of women, though neither woman would actually overtly claim to be a tradwife. But other women are overtly politically anti-feminist commentators, such as Hannah Pearl Davies, who you can see in the top left corner, who is in a video advocating that women should not vote and for a repeal of the 19th Amendment. Similarly, Procope Bell's study of so-called pick-me black women explores this paradoxical phenomenon whereby successful black female digital entrepreneurs encourage other black women to reject the material pressures of racialised capitalism and to find an apparent refuge from such systems in serving their husbands. The study of black women content creators who identify as pick-me women, a derogatory term to describe anti-feminist women, offers insight into the diversity within that trad women movement. Pick-me denotes the ability to be picked, chosen over other women by men. Entering into what Kandayoti theorised as the patriarchal bargain, pick-me black women strategically tailor themselves to the wishes of black manosphere men. In this manner, akin to manosphere men, they too adopt individualised solutions to structural problems within a system that remains unchanged. In the black manosphere, tactical patriarchal femininity exists, according to Procope Bell, to counter the oppressions of capitalism, white supremacy, and institutional patriarchy. Through their reaction to the misogynoirist material realities that victimise black women, anti-feminist black women find shadow forms of dignity. Within this logic, women are still subjected to male disavowal of their worth, except as it pertains to their role as a wife within the patriarchy. One of the gaps in the literature that we found is still not very much produced in relation to the implications of generative AI and the affordances that could be mobilised within the manosphere. We can see some of these trends occurring online, but we actually haven't found any articles yet in the literature about it. But I think it's an important development that we need to keep our eyes on. Thinking in particular about this incident that happened earlier this year with Ian Miles Chong, a far-right influencer, reposting an AI-generated modification of an adult content creator, Isla David, drawing on these misogynistic kind of trad wife stereotypes, where he says, when given pictures of thirst traps, AI imagines what could have been if they'd been raised by strong fathers. So the content creator was initially amused by this, but then she realised that, again, this is, even though it's dressing someone up rather than potentially creating a deep fake pornographic image, it's still a violation of her and her bodily autonomy, regardless of whether you're adding or removing clothes. Our literature review also considers the considerable important work being undertaken on violent extremism. Misogyny is a risk factor for violent extremism. I won't go into detail because the time is running out, but I will say that this is progressing and that the recent consideration of the Labor government in the United Kingdom to signal misogyny as a threat in the violent extremist landscape is a positive development in this sense, given what we know about the space and its mainstreaming. There's also exciting new work emerging looking at exiting from the manosphere. So some work particularly by Joshua Thorburn, who looks at the role of Reddit fora to potentially support men to disengage from incel logics. Just sum up our key findings. So we found increased mainstreaming and normalisation of manosphere ideas, particularly in regards to evolutionary psychology. Research on manfluences is relatively new and has tended to focus on processes of mainstreaming or on their negative influence in school settings. Much work remains to be done on the raft of manfluences emerging in non-English speaking countries. There's an increased threat of male supremacist terrorist attacks. We asked the question, what is the impact on the manosphere of the acceleration of AI capabilities? And finally, why does manosphere content have traction with some and not others? So there's a very strong need for in-depth interview research with manosphere adherents. I'll end there. Thank you.
We've got time for a couple of questions. So, do you have a microphone? No, it doesn't have. Yeah.
Not at the end? Do you want to?
I don't know.
We can do it with both papers.
I'm
I'm happy to wait and do it. Happen together.
Might spark more things.
Yeah, I think so.
When we present it together.
Okay, easy. Well, thanks very much, Vivian. Now we have Hayley Tran. Is your presentation loaded?
I don't know.
So let's find out. This one you? All right. Everyone, please welcome Hayley. She'll be talking about the role of precarious masculinity and male victimhood in shaping far-right online engagement among Australian men. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm actually quite glad that I've gone after Vivian, because now she's described to you the manosphere. Because I have half a slide on it. And there you go. That's the half slide. This is actually, today I'll be presenting a study, which is actually one of the 4 that I conducted in this topic. I've never actually been interested in the manosphere before, but I spent 6 months in the manosphere, and actually it is a very interesting space. Like Vivian's one of the slides, it reminded me that while I was in this space, I constantly thought, if there was a woman's sphere thing, would it actually ever be this successful? And what makes the manosphere this prolific? And so it basically drove a lot of the questions that I had and thought I could investigate. And so I ended up with 4 studies. But basically, so the first, oh, okay. Well, this is that's not even the slide. I guess I don't have a slide on the manosphere at all. Good. Basically, my quick overview of the manosphere, which, I described in my thesis very briefly, which is, it's just this whole conglomerate network of online communities that are centered around masculinity, often challenging modern gender norms, and advocating for traditional male roles. And in other words, it's basically a place for men, some men, to all come together and grieve on all these men's related issues. So after spending 6 months in there, that's all I could come up with. The reason that I decided to continue with it is because I obviously read a lot of literature about the intersection between the manosphere and the far right, and everyone keeps talking about, how it could be this gateway and all this stuff. And And there's lots of important research that has been done that was very inspiring, that has started the good work to have a look at exactly why the manosphere could potentially be this gateway. But what I actually really wanted, well, what I was hoping for, is more investigative studies that actually examine the psychosocial mechanisms that drive either people to the manosphere or when they're in the manosphere. Why do some people stay with, I don't know, aspiring to some kind of jawline, but others then progress to this rabbit hole of all this far-right extremist stuff. So because of that gap, that's exactly what I went to do. So how I did that, basically with the 4 studies, the overarching theory that I used was relative deprivation theory. And, you know, traditionally relative deprivation theory has always been used in, you know, economic and finance type work. But I decided to adapt it to this space because, I mean, ultimately, isn't that what this whole thing is? It's feeling deprived of one's masculinity, of one's manhood. And so I used a more, I guess, the contemporary version of relative deprivation theory, which is based on Heather Smith's work. And I really like it because it is highly structured, which makes it a lot easier to study with. And it's got the 3 phases. So it basically describes that the experience of being relatively deprived arises when people perceive a discrepancy between what they have and what they believe that they deserve. But based on this framework, it's not just enough to believe, okay, well, I don't have something, but it doesn't mean that you feel deprived. And so after you make these comparisons, you have to make this appraisal that, well, what I don't have is actually unjust and it's unfair. And I do deserve more and I deserve better, which then results in an emotional state or an expression. So you, as Heather would describe, that should be a sort of an emotion that drives a behavior, so an outcome. Or an attitude. It could change your beliefs, your attitudes, or behavior. But you've got to be either angry or resentful. You know, they're action-oriented emotions. And another concept that I actually used quite heavily in this particular study was the concept of precarious masculinity. I felt like this was super relevant. Basically, Professor Vandello describes this paradigm. Manhood is a social status. So it's not only difficult to earn. Okay, it's based on these 3 pillars. It's not only difficult to earn, but it's even harder to maintain. And because it's easily lost, we have to continuously maintain this and defend it. And so I guess, you know, even if you just did a quick qualitative review of the manosphere, you can just see these 3 pillars going on and on and on in circles. Another key concept is what I'm calling it. This is nobody else's thing. I'm calling it collective male victimhood. So that's one of the studies that I conducted prior to this, because if we want to capture this and measure it somehow, there was nothing that was existing that I could find that really captured all these things in the manosphere, because it's so wildly broad, and it includes so many different things. But one of the things I did was I developed and then validated this scale, and I ended up calling it the collective male victimhood scale, because it's basically it's a measure of it's a belief system that men as a group are systematically disadvantaged or unfairly treated in society across different contexts like the workplace, media portrayal, government policies, everything. And so based on these theories and concepts, I propose that basically when men perceive threats to their masculinity, or threats or deprivations, they may compensate by showing a preference for watching different types of manosphere content. So, you know, that's what's the difference between just watching general, I don't know, videos on how to date women successfully versus, you know, far-right content. And so this preference may be further influenced by pre-existing beliefs, I feel, of collective male victimhood. So the focus of this study was to test these causal relationships through an experiment that incorporates these theories and concepts. And my aim was to basically firstly examine how precarious masculinity influences these media preferences. And then secondly, I looked at how perceptions of collective male victimhood then shaped people's consumption, I guess, preferences of far-right content. So I did this via an online, I recruited Australian men online. At the end, I ended up collecting 278 participants, and it was quite diverse. You know, there was nothing unusual about any characteristics of and socio-demographic data. It's all quite normal looking. And I designed an experiment where it was basically a cross-sectional 2x2 factorial design. I wanted to keep it super simple because so many things go wrong in experiments, and I just had to control everything as cleanly as I could. I had basically one group that was the experimental group with manipulation, and then the other group was controls. Yeah. So the scale that I was just speaking about, these are the items, the 8 items at the end that I came up with for the scale. And so if you have a look, some of it is quite absurd actually, but people, it really spoke to them and they understood it in a way that they could answer it honestly. And the reason why I know that is because I also conducted interviews with Australian men, and I did a mock online survey, except with real people in real life, where I did this cognitive interview, and I said, just tell me all the things as you're thinking about it so I can walk through what makes sense and what doesn't make sense to you. And so we ended up crafting this thing because I didn't want to just create like a scale and just assume that it's going to work. So those were the 8 items. This is the actual experiment, and people actually ask me how I basically asked these men to do this, because it does sound absurd when I say it out loud, but basically I advertised it as, this is a PhD project. It aims to improve our understanding about manhood, social media use in Australian men. We will collect data using anonymous online surveys, and we have questions about your views on manhood and your social media viewing preferences. You will be asked to answer questions or statements so we can measure your masculinity level. You will then be given results that could indicate your masculinity level to be less, similar, or higher than the average Australian men. And then you'll get these results, and it will tell you basically how manly you are. A lot of people find it funny, but then like it literally only took me hours to recruit this amount of people. And I realized it was a thing because, well, you know, basically spending 6 months in the manosphere, I realized this thing proliferates so much because one of the most prominent and, you know, popular videos are the ones that give you a score at the end. So we basically, I gave them a test that was basically bogus. It like had nothing to do with anything, other than like saying manly stuff. And regardless of the responses, people were randomized into two groups. Participants were either in the threat condition or, you know, they were told that they're manly at 73%. And then I basically had to also check that this actually was upsetting to them, which was terrible, but I had to make sure that it worked. And so I asked, you know, questions like, how did you feel about your results and stuff like that? And then also at the end, I had to make sure that they were kind of angry about it. And they were. After the test and the manipulation check, I immediately gave them a bunch of videos. These were very typical of what you'd find in the manosphere. And I basically said, would you watch these on a scale of 1 to 7? How do you feel? Like, yeah. And to my surprise, when we looked at the actual experiment alone, so if we only looked at the experiment, the manipulation group versus the control group, there was actually no significant finding. Okay, so this suggests that the effect of masculinity threat by itself depended on the type, basically suggests that overall, the threat condition, it didn't actually significantly alter participants' preferences for either types of videos, okay, not just normal manosphere ones or far-right ones. Basically, these factors alone did not significantly influence people's viewing preferences. However, the interaction between the experimental condition, so basically the interaction between whether you were threatened or not and the type of video that you looked at, that was significant. So when we looked at specifically types of videos, masculinity types of videos, the control condition actually reported higher preferences compared to those in the threat condition, and this difference was significant. But in contrast, for far-right videos, participants in the threat condition reported slightly higher preferences for far-right videos. And then the other thing I tested was basically I thought that men with high beliefs of collective male victimhood will report higher preferences for far-right videos. I think that's quite a sensible thing to hypothesize. And yes, it was true. So basically what these graphs show is, if you started off with this idea that collectively there is a thing in society where men are victims, you're probably going to end up watching both kinds, but you're probably going to love far-right videos more. Then I broke it down and looked at those who had a low level of collective malehood. So not none. So they still had this idea that there was a sense of group victimhood, but low versus high. And that was quite interesting too. The analysis showed a significant interaction effect between whether you were low or high in the threat condition. So basically the interaction between whether or not you believed that there's a collective victimhood level and the threat condition on far-right video preferences, they were significant. I'll just show you this other graph, actually, that might make more sense. So overall, though, I will say if you had high collective male victimhood beliefs, we saw basically a ceiling effect. Okay, so if you believed in this thing, you're more likely to watch both kinds of videos more compared to those with low CMV. And that was also significant for far-right videos. So in summary, masculinity, threats, and video preferences, the study found that this does lead men to prefer far-right content over masculinity content. Specifically, men in the threat condition showed reduced preferences for masculinity videos likely because this content reminded them of their insecurities and how bad they felt. They kept talking about that after, like, you know, the test. And they probably avoided watching more masculinity videos. But then, you know, instead, maybe far-right content actually provided a better sense of way to cope with it because it externalizes blame and it provides an empowering group narrative. I don't know, maybe that's why it's more appealing. And also collective victimhood and far-right content. There was a significant correlation between high CMV beliefs and preferences for far-right content. And it supports the idea that group-level grievances do play a role in far-right engagement. CMV was a strong predictor for both far-right and masculinity videos, but more so for far-right, suggesting that men with high CMV beliefs are drawn to the manosphere content that affirms traditional masculine identities and directs grievances towards our groups. And these were some of the implications I came up with because I didn't want to do 4 studies and be like, yeah, I don't know what happens now. So these are some of my ideas that potentially we could do to help people. Basically, the manosphere, you know, these are some of the takeaway things. First, manosphere, it is, while this is just a cross-sectional study and, you know, experiments aren't the thing that, you know, says everything, but, you know, based on this, on these findings, the manosphere, it does look like it serves a potential pathway to far-right ideologies where personal grievances are redirected to perhaps more collective grievances that align with more far-right narratives. Perhaps that's why it's appealing. And then there's also this very interesting interplay between personal grievances and collective grievances. It seems as though people who have an individual level of deprivation, so that's what we did with the masculinity threat. So at an individual level, personal level, when we combine that with a group level deprivation, like people who feel like there's a group victimhood belief, so this suggests that the effect of masculinity threats on far right engagement depends, on these collective grievances. So the combination can amplify the susceptibility of finding far right ideas quite appealing. I have no more time, but these things are here. You can ask me about them later. And I just wanted to acknowledge the actual participants that, that did this work with me, and also all the men that I interviewed. They were actually amazing. I'm not a gender studies person, but I actually feel like there is space and it's the right time to do this. And I'm hopeful. So thank you all for listening.